On the 4th of April 1961, a Japanese politician named Masanobu Tsuji boarded an Air France flight at Haneda Airport, bound for Southeast Asia. He told colleagues he was going on an inspection tour, requested 40 days of leave from the Japanese parliament where he had been sitting as an elected member since 1952. He asked a friend to forward his suitcase home from Laos and told him to expect him back around May 10th. The suitcase arrived at Haneda with a note. Tsuji did not, and the Japanese government would not declare him legally dead until July 20th, 1968, 7 years after anyone had last set eyes on him. This would be a minor mystery if Tsuji were an ordinary man. He was not. Masanobu Tsuji was the most dangerous Japanese officer of the Second World War. He had planned the Malayan campaign and the fall of Singapore. He had ordered the massacre of Chinese civilians in that city. He had been implicated in the Bataan Death March. He had eaten part of a downed American airman's liver, cooked and served at an officer's dinner. And he had done it deliberately and without apparent remorse. When Japan surrendered, he went underground to avoid the war crimes tribunals that were hunting him, and spent 3 years in hiding across Thailand, China and Vietnam, before returning to Japan in 1948, writing a best-selling memoir about his years as a fugitive and running for parliament. He won. And when he disappeared in Laos in 1961, there were people who believed he had gone to advise the North Vietnamese. This story has been sitting in the back of my mind since I came across Tsuji a few months ago while reading about this. One thing led to another, and I ended up spending several weeks going through the history of what actually happened to Japanese soldiers in Vietnam after the war ended. The numbers are not small, and the impact is not minor. And nobody has told this story properly in English because it sits at the intersection of 3 conflicts that most people treat as separate. The Second World War, the First Indochina War, and eventually the conflict that Americans simply call Vietnam. These are not separate stories, they connect through specific men. Men who had fought under the Japanese flag in Burma and Cambodia and across Southeast Asia, who in August 1945 were suddenly in a country that the French were coming back to claim, who looked at the situation and made a calculation that the Viet Minh's War of Independence was worth joining. Some of them died in Vietnam. Some were forced to leave families behind when the war ended and spent the rest of their lives in Japan trying to forget what they had left. Some never came home at all. And here is the thing that makes this genuinely insane. The French forces they were fighting contained veterans of the Waffen-SS Germany, and Japan had been allies. Now German SS veterans in French Foreign Legion uniforms were killing Vietnamese soldiers that Japanese veterans had trained, former Axis allies on opposite sides of the same jungle war, fighting each other 8 years after they had been part of the same pact. The Second World War did not end cleanly, it dissolved into other conflicts and took its personnel with it. Today's video is sponsored by Free Cash. Everything's expensive right now, and most of us wouldn't mind a bit of extra cash for doing something we'd be doing anyway, so Free Cash. I'm also not going to sit here and tell you it's life-changing, because it isn't. It's small amounts that add up. Here's how it actually works. Companies spend a fortune on ads that everyone skips. Free Cash flips it round. Instead of paying to interrupt you, they pay you to actually try the thing yourself. Play a game, test an app, do a survey. You pick an offer, you do it, you get paid, and it's completely legit. 4.6 stars on Trustpilot, hundreds of thousands of reviews. One thing you've got to do. Turn app tracking on. That's the only way the game can see how far you've got. And that's how Free Cash knows to pay you. Cash out at $25, PayPal, crypto, or a gift card. So here's what to do. Click the link in the description or the pinned comment, or scan the QR code on screen and complete your first offer. That gets you a $10 bonus, which is nearly half of the $25 you need to cash out. If you're sat on your phone tonight anyway, you may as well be getting something back for it. Japan had occupied French Indochina since September 1940, when it had pressured the Vichy French administration into allowing Japanese military basing rights in exchange for leaving the French colonial administration nominally in place. For 4 years, the Japanese and French had coexisted uneasily in Indochina, the Japanese controlling strategic resources and using the territory as a staging ground for operations elsewhere in Southeast Asia, while the French colonial administration maintained the day-to-day running of the country. Vietnamese nationalists watched both of them with the specific attention of people who understood that the European and Asian powers occupying their country had different interests that might eventually produce an opportunity. Ho Chi Minh had been building the Viet Minh since 1941 with support from Chinese nationalists who saw a Vietnamese independence movement as strategically useful against Japan. The organization was not primarily military, it was political, designed to create the mass base that Maoist doctrines said a liberation movement needed before it could win. By 1945, the Viet Minh had significant rural networks across the north and a smaller urban presence, but it had very limited military capability. What it had were organizers and agitators and political cadres. What it did not have was an army capable of fighting a European colonial power with trained professional soldiers and modern weapons. On March 9th, 1945, the Japanese ended the pretense of French-Japanese coexistence and launched a coup throughout Indochina, disarming the French colonial forces in a single night and imprisoning or killing the French administrative and military personnel. The coup removed the French from power entirely and left Indochina under direct Japanese military administration for the remaining 5 months of the war. Some French soldiers escaped into the jungle and made their way to China. Most were captured, some were killed. The French knew exactly what had happened and did not forget it. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the situation in Indochina was unlike anywhere else the war ended. The Japanese had destroyed French authority 6 months earlier. The Viet Minh had declared Vietnamese independence on September 2, 1945, with Ho Chi Minh reading the declaration in Hanoi, and the declaration specifically quoted the American Declaration of Independence, a calculated message to the United States that this was a liberation movement, not a communist coup. British forces arrived in the south of the country to accept the Japanese surrender, south of the 16th parallel. Chinese nationalist forces arrived in the north. Neither group had any particular interest in restoring French colonial rule, and the Viet Minh moved quickly to establish administrative facts on the ground, while the colonial power was still absent. The French returned anyway. They came back into the south first, assisted by the British who armed Japanese prisoners of war to help maintain order while French forces arrived. The irony of this, of arming the men Japan had just defeated to help restore French colonialism, was not lost on Vietnamese observers. The French moved north more slowly and negotiated with Ho Chi Minh through 1946, before those negotiations collapsed and the shooting started. Into this specific moment stepped approximately 5,000 Japanese soldiers who had not yet been repatriated. The Japanese military presence in Indochina at the end of the war numbered in the tens of thousands. The repatriation process was underway throughout late 1945 and 1946, ships moving men from Vietnamese ports back to Japan under Allied supervision. Most went home and some did not. The reasons varied and were personal and specific to each man. Some had married Vietnamese women and could not imagine leaving them. Some had built lives in the country over 4 years of occupation and felt more at home there than they would in a defeated Japan. Others were ideologically committed to the Pan-Asian liberation framework that Japanese imperial propaganda had promoted, and the Viet Minh's war against French colonialism fit that framework better than returning to a destroyed and occupied Japan. Some were simply presented with an offer by Viet Minh recruiters who understood exactly what experienced Japanese officers and NCOs could do for a military organization that desperately needed what those men had. Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh was not squeamish about the history between Vietnam and Japan. The Japanese occupation had been brutal. Enforced rice quotas had caused a famine in 1944 and 1945 that killed between 400,000 and 2 million Vietnamese, depending on the estimate used, in the northern provinces. Ho Chi Minh knew what Japanese occupation had meant for his country, and he used it for his own purposes in terms of the specific men he recruited. What he needed was military expertise, and he needed it faster than any other source could provide it. He needed men who could teach conventional military discipline, infantry tactics, weapons handling, and the specific skills of company and battalion level operations to fighters who had been organized primarily around guerrilla resistance rather than conventional warfare. The Japanese army, whatever else it had been, had produced men who knew how to do those things. Ho made the calculation that their expertise was worth more than the complication of their history. Gosha, the leading academic researcher on this period, estimates that perhaps a third of the Japanese who remained in Vietnam after the main repatriation were absorbed into the Viet Minh structure in one capacity or another. Some were soldiers and officers who volunteered, some were specialists, doctors, engineers, ordnance experts, who were in some cases coerced rather than recruited. The distinction between volunteering and being effectively compelled when you are a stranded Japanese soldier in a country that is moving rapidly toward armed conflict with European forces is not always clear, but the result was a Japanese military presence inside the Viet Minh that was substantial enough to be documented by French intelligence from the earliest months of the war. The first of the men who matter to this story was Mukayama, a former staff officer in the 38th Army. He became the overall technical advisor to the Vietnamese military and was credited by subsequent historians as the leader of the Japanese contingent within the Viet Minh. He became an advisor directly to General Vo Nguyen Giap, the man who would eventually defeat both the French and the Americans and who is studied in military academies today as one of the great commanders of the 20th century. What Giap absorbed from Mukayama in those early months, the principles of conventional military discipline, logistics, and operational planning that the Imperial Japanese Army had refined across years of Pacific war fighting, became foundational to the Viet Minh's transformation from a guerrilla network into a conventional military force. Mukayama was killed in combat in 1946, one of the first of the Japanese volunteers to die in the war he had chosen to join. Major Igawase was a staff officer in the 34th Independent Mixed Brigade who had served in Vietnam during the occupation. He was the man who conceived the idea that would become the most significant Japanese contribution to the First Indochina War. Before the academy was built, before the curriculum was written, before a single Vietnamese officer was trained in the methods that would eventually defeat the French at Dien Bien Phu, Igawa looked at the Viet Minh's military situation in late 1945 and understood that the fundamental problem was not weapons or political will, it was military knowledge. The Viet Minh fighters who were preparing to resist the French return had courage and political commitment and local knowledge. They did not know how to conduct a set-piece assault, how to coordinate a night attack across multiple axes of advance, how to organize a battalion-level operation, how to maintain tactical communications in contact. Igawa knew how to do all of these things and had the Japanese Army's extensive educational methodology to draw on. He began planning an officer training school before he died. He was killed before it opened. Leading a Viet Minh force toward Pleiku in 1946, pushing toward a strategic point on the central plateau that the Viet Minh needed to control, his column was ambushed by French troops on the road. He was killed in action. He never saw the school he had planned become operational. The man who carried Igawa's idea forward and made it real was Major Ishi Takwo. He was 26 years old in December 1945, when he deserted from the Japanese military in Cambodia with several comrades and made his way to Vietnam. He had been a staff officer in the 55th Division in Burma, supposedly the youngest major in the Imperial Army. He crossed into Vietnam without a clear plan, beyond the conviction that going home was not something he intended to do. He made contact with the Viet Minh through networks that the Japanese occupation had left in place across the country, found Viet Minh commanders who understood immediately what a 26-year-old major with Burma campaign experience could offer, and was absorbed into the military structure they were building. By 1946, he was heading the Quang Ngai Military Academy as its provisional commander. The academy was established in June 1946 in Quang Ngai Province in central Vietnam, a Viet Minh-controlled area that the French had not yet reached. Ishi and 6 other Japanese officers formed the core of its faculty. The curriculum was Japanese Army methodology translated into Vietnamese operational conditions. The students were Viet Minh fighters and officers who came through in batches, receiving training that none of them could have gotten anywhere else because there was nowhere else that was providing it. More than 400 Vietnamese officers and soldiers were trained at Quang Ngai before the academy ceased operations. Some of those 400 men eventually became generals in the army that fought the United States in the 1960s and 1970s. The tactical DNA that Ishi planted at Quang Ngai in 1946 was still producing results 20 years later against American forces. What Ishi taught was specific and documented. Assaults on fixed positions, night attacks with multiple converging units, company and battalion level exercises integrating infantry, mortars, and light artillery, tactical communications procedures that allowed dispersed units to coordinate movement without breaking radio silence, and navigation by map and compass in terrain that had no landmarks. The specific skills that the Imperial Japanese Army had refined across the Pacific War, and that the Viet Minh had no way of developing without someone who had lived them. One French military report from 1947 noted with specific concern that the tactical behaviour of Viet Minh units in the northern provinces had changed qualitatively from the previous year. The assault patterns were more disciplined. The night attacks showed coordination that suggested professional training. The ambush techniques were more sophisticated. The French intelligence conclusion was that Japanese military personnel were directly responsible for the improvement. In southern Trung Bo province, French intelligence documented that 36 of 50 military instructors attached to Viet Minh units were Japanese. These were not advisors but instructors, men who were actively running training programs for Vietnamese fighters, who were going to use what they learned against French soldiers within months of completing their courses. In Hanoi, a Western-educated Japanese scholar named Kiyoshi Komatsu ran the Viet Minh's International Committee for the Aid and Support of the DRV, the organization that managed foreign military and technical assistance to Ho Chi Minh's government. In Thanh Nguyen province, Japanese ordnance experts were running an arms manufacturing facility, producing weapons and ammunition for the Viet Minh from whatever materials were locally available. The French also identified 11 Japanese nurses and 2 doctors working for the Viet Minh in northern Vietnam in 1951, 5 years into the war, still there, still serving. The first major test of what the Japanese-trained Viet Minh could do came in December 1946. French forces bombarded Haiphong Harbour in November 1946, killing significant numbers of Vietnamese civilians, and the political negotiation that had been attempting to find a settlement between France and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam collapsed entirely. On the evening of December 19, 1946, Viet Minh operatives smuggled explosives past French guards into Hanoi's main power plant, to the Viet Bac, the mountainous region north of Hanoi that would be the Viet Minh's stronghold for the next 7 years. But the battle had demonstrated something the French had not expected. The Viet Minh could organize and execute a coordinated urban assault across multiple objectives simultaneously. That level of operational coordination did not come from political organization. It came from military training. The Japanese at Quang Ngai had been doing their job. In 1947, the documentation of Japanese direct combat involvement becomes explicit. In Hue that year, the French reported battling a Japanese assault force of 150 men operating as a coherent unit under Japanese command. These were not advisors, they were combatants, former Imperial Army soldiers fighting in formation against French forces. The French report noted the specific qualities that identified the unit as Japanese-led, the tactical discipline, the coordinated use of terrain, the night movement capabilities. The Viet Minh units operating under Japanese command or Japanese influence command were measurably more effective than those operating without that input. Also in 1947, Ishi Takuo set up an ambush that killed more than 70 French soldiers. The specific details of the ambush are not fully documented in the available sources, but its outcome is. 70 French soldiers killed in a single engagement is a significant tactical result for a guerrilla force in the early years of an asymmetric conflict. It demonstrates that Ishii was not merely teaching, he was commanding. He had moved from instructor to operational commander, and he was using what he knew to kill Frenchmen in the jungle of a country he had come to on a desertion, and had decided was now his war. In 1947, the French launched Operation Leia, their most ambitious attempt to destroy the Viet Minh leadership in a single decapitation strike. 3 French columns converged on the Viet Bac in October 1947, attempting to surround and destroy Ho Chi Minh's government in exile. The operation was carefully planned and used French airborne forces, riverborne units, and armoured columns simultaneously. It failed. Giap's forces slipped through the closing French net, using the mountain terrain that Japanese-trained navigators and guides knew better than the French forces pursuing them. Ho Chi Minh escaped capture. The Viet Bac remained a Viet Minh stronghold. The French had to retreat and acknowledge that their strategy of mobile columns and decapitation strikes was not going to end the war. In 1948, the pattern of French isolated outposts being attacked at night on difficult terrain demonstrated itself with brutal clarity at Pu Tong Hoa. A French garrison holding an isolated position was assaulted at night by Viet Minh forces using the coordinated multi-axis assault techniques that the Quang Ngai Academy had been teaching. The garrison held after desperate fighting, but the pattern was clear. The Viet Minh were attacking French positions at night on broken terrain, using approaches that French defensive planning had not anticipated. with coordination that suggested professional military training rather than improvisation. The French officers writing after-action reports noted specific tactical signatures that they associated with Japanese military methodology. Ishii Takuo died in 1950 at 31 years old. He had spent 5 years fighting in Vietnam, building the Quang Ngai Academy, commanding combat operations against the French, training hundreds of officers who would go on to fight 2 more wars. He stepped on a landmine somewhere in the Central Highlands and was killed. He is commemorated at the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, alongside other Japanese soldiers who died in the First Indochina War, a fact that has its own complicated dimension given that the Yasukuni Shrine is also where Japan's convicted war criminals are enshrined, and that the political implications of that commemoration have caused diplomatic friction with multiple Asian countries for decades. Nakahara Mitsunobu survived. He was born in 1922 in Ehime Prefecture, and had been captain of the Kendo Club at Hosei University before graduating early in 1944 when the war needed him. He was assigned to Hue in 1944 as an intelligence officer with the 34th Independent Mixed Brigade. By July 1945, before Japan had even surrendered, he had already made contact with the Viet Minh. He had been watching the political situation in Indochina for months and had arrived at conclusions about which way things were going. When Japan surrendered in August, he did not wait for repatriation orders. In April 1946, he was appointed as an instructor at the Quang Ngai Military Academy by General Nguyen Son, where he ran the 2nd Battalion Training Program. His Vietnamese name was Nguyen Minh Ngoc. He taught Vietnamese officers the craft he had learned at Kumamoto Army Reserve Military Academy, the specific institutional knowledge of the Imperial Japanese Army translated into the operational requirements of a liberation war. He went home eventually. When the Geneva Accords ended the First Indochina War in 1954, Nakahara was among those repatriated. He went back to Japan, settled in Kamakura, and lived until 2003, dying at the age of 81, with the specific quality of life experience that comes from having been a Japanese Imperial intelligence officer who spent 8 years training the army that defeated France in Asia. He was interviewed by Japanese researchers in later years and described his time with the Viet Minh with the measured precision of a man who had processed a complicated experience over decades. His account is one of the few first-hand Japanese descriptions of what the Quang Ngai Academy actually felt like from the inside, what the Vietnamese students were like, what they learned and how quickly they learned it, and what it meant to be a Japanese officer teaching the enemies of the French in the jungles of central Vietnam in 1946. Now the contradiction. Because while Japanese veterans were training the Viet Minh, the French Expeditionary Corps fighting against them contained a significant number of men with their own complicated recent history. The French Foreign Legion, which formed a substantial and elite component of the French forces in Indochina, had recruited heavily from German veterans after 1945. Germany had surrendered. Many former Wehrmacht soldiers and Waffen-SS veterans had no country to return to in any meaningful sense, or were avoiding war crimes prosecution, or had simply acquired a taste for military life that civilian post-war Germany could not satisfy. The Foreign Legion offered wages, structure, anonymity, and a new identity. Thousands of Germans took it. These men, German veterans of the Second World War fighting in French Foreign Legion uniforms in Indochina, were encountering Vietnamese forces trained by Japanese veterans of the Second World War. Germany and Japan had been Axis allies. The Tripartite Pact had bound them together in the same war against the same enemies. A former SS Panzer Grenadier, who had fought on the Eastern Front from 1941 to 1945, was now in a French jungle engaging forces trained by a man who had served in Burma and Cambodia under the same Axis umbrella that the SS soldier had operated under. Former allies, now enemies, fighting each other in a colonial war in Southeast Asia for reasons that had nothing to do with the ideological conflict that had defined both their careers. The French Foreign Legion's German contingent fought in some of the most brutal engagements of the Indochina War. The Route Coloniale for disaster in 1950, the single greatest French defeat of the war, before Dien Bien Phu saw Legion units destroyed by Viet Minh forces under Giap that were operating with a level of conventional military capability that had been specifically built through the Japanese training program. The ambushes along RC4 that destroyed French columns in the That Khe and Dong Khe corridor demonstrated the full result of what the Quang Ngai Academy had produced. Vietnamese commanders executing complex multi-column ambushes in difficult terrain, maintaining tactical communication and coordination under fire, destroying French forces that had superior equipment and had expected to be fighting a guerrilla opponent. The Viet Minh officers who planned and led those operations in 1950 had received their foundational military training from Japanese officers between 1946 and 1950. Some of them had been trained directly by Ishitakuo, who died the same year the RC-4 battles demonstrated what he had taught. The chain from the Imperial Japanese Army's tactical methodology to the jungle ambushes that destroyed French columns in 1950 runs directly through the Quang Ngai Military Academy and the Japanese officers who ran it. Giap later acknowledged in his memoirs the importance of the assistance the Vietnamese received from foreign fighters in the early years of the war, without specifying the Japanese contribution in detail, partly because the political dimension of acknowledging Japanese military help was complicated in a country that had experienced Japanese occupation, and partly because by the time Giap was writing memoirs the specifics were less important than the outcome. Masanobu Tsuji requires his own account because he is not like the other men in this story. He is not a professional soldier who made a human decision about which side he was on. He is something more disturbing than that. Tsuji was born in 1902 in Ishikawa Prefecture and had followed the classic imperial officer path. He was a leading proponent of Gekokujo, the Japanese military concept of loyal insubordination, acting without or contrary to explicit orders in pursuit of what the subordinate believed was the correct strategic result. This was not an uncommon philosophy in the Imperial Army, but Tsuji applied it with a specific intensity that made him simultaneously brilliant and catastrophic in roughly equal measure. He was the main architect of the Malayan campaign, the assault that took the supposedly impregnable British fortress of Singapore in 70 days, and resulted in the largest surrender of British forces in history. The campaign caught the British at every point at which they were most vulnerable. It also produced the Alexandra Hospital massacre, in which Japanese soldiers killed wounded Allied patients and hospital staff, and the Sukching, the systematic massacre of ethnic Chinese civilians in Singapore, that killed between 25,000 and 50,000 people. Tsuji ordered the Sukching. Other Japanese officers were executed after the war for following his orders. Tsuji was not in Singapore when those trials happened. He had also been linked to atrocities in the Philippines and Burma, and the incident that defines him most precisely is the documented account that he had part of the liver of a downed American airman cooked and served at an officer's dinner in Burma, eating it deliberately and describing it afterward without evident shame. It was a considered act by a man who wanted the officers around him to register something specific about his relationship to the enemy. When Japan surrendered, Allied prosecutors were actively searching for Tsuji. He went into hiding in Thailand, wearing monk's robes and travelling under assumed identities before making his way to China, where he worked as an employee of Chinese nationalist intelligence. He visited Vietnam, where the Viet Minh were beginning their resistance against the returning French, and by his own account was offered a role working with anti-French forces but declined. His account of declining this offer is the only account that exists, which means it should be treated with appropriate skepticism, given that the rest of his documented behaviour suggests a man who declined nothing that interested him. He returned to Japan in 1948 and wrote a best-selling memoir about his years in hiding called Senko Sanzenri. 3,000 Li in hiding was elected to the House of Representatives in 1952 and re-elected twice on a platform of Japanese rearmament, and spent the 1950s as a public figure writing books about the campaigns he had planned and giving interviews to journalists who treated him as a military genius rather than a war criminal. In April 1961, he told his colleagues in Parliament he was going to Southeast Asia for 40 days, requested his leave, and boarded a plane whose planned route included Singapore, where he was still wanted for the Sukching, then Burma, Thailand, South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The speculation about what happened to him covers several possibilities. He may have been killed in the Laotian Civil War, which was active in 1961, and was the kind of conflict in which a former Japanese staff officer wandering around without clear affiliation could easily end up dead without anyone officially acknowledging it. He may have been killed by CIA or Allied intelligence assets who had been tracking him and decided that a war criminal who was moving toward a relationship with the North Vietnamese was not a complication they wanted to manage. He may have been deliberately absorbed into the North Vietnamese advisory structure and died there later under a false identity. One military writer looking at the North Vietnamese campaigns of the 1960s wrote, that when one considers the ruthless brilliance of the North Vietnamese operations, the hand of Masanobu Tsuji can be seen clearly. This is not documentary evidence, it is the observation of a man who understood what Tsuji's specific kind of operational thinking looked like when it was applied, and thought he recognized it in what Giap was doing. The women who were left behind when this history ended are not part of the military record, but they are the most human part of the story. When the 1954 Geneva Accords brought the war to an end, the Vietnamese government began the process of repatriating the Japanese fighters who had served with the Viet Minh. The first group, 71 men, were required to leave the country. They were not given the option of bringing their Vietnamese wives or children. The decision was administrative and final. 71 men who had spent 8 or 9 years in Vietnam, who had married Vietnamese women and fathered Vietnamese children, who had built lives in the country that were more real to them than the Japan they had left, walked onto ships and went home. Their families stayed behind. One of those women was Xuan. Her husband had been among the 700 Japanese who stayed in Vietnam after 1945. She was 29 and pregnant with her third child when he left in 1954. She thought he was going on a temporary assignment. She thought he would be back in a year or two. She waited 6 years with no information. After 6 years with no word, she concluded he had died, and set up an altar in her home to worship his memory, as the dead are worshipped. He was not dead. He was in Japan, having been required to leave without warning, and without being able to send word to her. The North Vietnamese government did not facilitate communication between the repatriated Japanese and the families they had been forced to leave. Xuan raised 3 children alone on a rice farm outside Hanoi. The villagers called her Xuan Hat, Japanese Xuan, and not as a term of affection. She was 92 years old when Japanese Emperor Akihito visited Vietnam on a state visit and met with 16 surviving Vietnamese wives of Japanese soldiers. The emperor expressed his sympathies. The women who had built altars to worship living men as if they were dead, who had raised children under the specific social difficulty of being the woman who had married one of the occupiers, who had spent decades in the specific poverty of the Hanoi rice farming community without the economic contribution of a husband, received the emperor's sympathies in 2017, 72 years after the Japanese soldiers had first chosen to stay. The 400 Vietnamese officers who trained at Quang Ngai did not all survive the wars that followed. Some died fighting the French, some in the years between 1954 and 1959, when the country was nominally at peace, and some were still alive and serving when the American military arrived in Vietnam in significant numbers in the 1960s, and found an opponent unlike anything they had encountered in Korea or in any other post-war conflict. Giap's army, which had beaten the French and which would eventually beat the Americans, had its roots in the specific military education that the Japanese officers at Quang Ngai had provided in 1946. The assaults, the night attacks, the battalion-level exercises, the navigation and communications discipline that Ishitakuo and his colleagues had taught to those first 400 Vietnamese students became the foundational methodology of an army that fought continuously from 1946 to 1975 and won every war it fought. Ishii was killed by a landmine in 1950, Mukayama died in combat in 1946, Igawa was killed in ambush the same year, Nakahara died in Kamakura in 2003, and Tsuji disappeared in 1961 and was declared legally dead 7 years later. The Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo commemorates a number of Japanese soldiers who died fighting in the First Indochina War. They are listed among Japan's war dead, men who died in service of something. What exactly that something was depends on which frame you use. The Pan-Asian frame says they died fighting colonialism. The Vietnamese national history frame says they were foreign fighters who contributed to independence. The French military frame says they were enemy combatants who made the First Indochina War more costly. The Japanese national frame is complicated by the fact that they were deserters from the Imperial Army who had not gone home when Japan told them to. The Vietnamese women who survived them and the children those women raised do not fit neatly into any of these frames. They live the consequences of decisions that were made in 1945 and 1946 by men who are now dead, and whose military significance is studied while their personal accountability is not. Xuan set up an altar to worship her husband as dead. He was not dead. He had simply never come back. The broader French military picture in Indochina from 1947 to 1950 shows a force that had not processed the specific implications of what it was facing. The French Expeditionary Corps was professional, experienced and equipped. It had armoured units, artillery and air support that the Viet Minh could not match in conventional terms. Its commanders were men who had fought in the Second World War and had absorbed the lessons of European conventional combat. What they had not absorbed, because there was no European equivalent to draw on, was the specific quality of opponent that Japanese-trained Vietnamese forces represented in the jungle terrain of Indochina. The French operating procedure was to establish fortified outposts along the main roads and river routes, maintaining control of the infrastructure, while mobile columns operated from those bases to engage Viet Minh forces in the interior. The system had worked in earlier colonial conflicts. Against the Viet Minh, it produced a pattern of isolated outposts that were attacked at night by forces that knew exactly how to approach them, how to suppress their defensive fire, and how to withdraw before reinforcements arrived. The pattern repeated across dozens of engagements between 1947 and 1950, each one tactically small and strategically accumulating toward the RC-4 disaster of 1950, when the pattern matured into the capability to destroy entire French columns rather than merely pick off outposts. The German veterans in the Foreign Legion who fought in these engagements were not men who lacked courage or tactical skill. They were men who had survived the Eastern Front and North Africa and the Ardennes. What they found in Indochina was an opponent whose behaviour did not match the opponent they had been trained against. A Waffen-SS veteran who had fought Soviet infantry in Russia understood how Soviet infantry attacked. He did not have a reference frame for a Viet Minh assault that incorporated Japanese night movement techniques, Japanese communications discipline, and Japanese battalion-level coordination executed by Vietnamese soldiers who had absorbed those techniques in 6 months of intensive instruction at a military academy in the Central Highlands. The tactical language the Viet Minh was speaking was Japanese, and the French and German soldiers fighting them were reading it phonetically without knowing the grammar.